This is what Matthew writes. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. That must have taken a long time. And so, as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." But Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," Jesus said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. And then taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves, then gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. And the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, the hoo-ha at the back was my fault because I brought some slides to give you a little illustration, but I'm afraid without the expert here, Steve, we didn't know how to integrate them, so I'll have to explain to you what the pictures would have been. I do remember some years back, there was a craze going around where you went to a bookshop and you bought a book, and in it were every page full of patterns, and repetitive patterns, and, basically very random or very repetitive. And what you do, said the book, is that you look at them in a certain way, and after a time there emerges from it a 3D picture of something, like a fish or an animal or a house or whatever. But you had to look at it. You squint your eyes and kind of slightly squint your vision, and you would be able to see it. Well, some were able to see it, some wouldn't. I remember some people that I was sharing it with, I suddenly saw it, I thought, wow, this is brilliant. I showed it to them. They stared at it for about 10 minutes, nothing. So some people saw it and some people didn't. And the name of this technical name for this actual picture is an autostereogram. An autostereogram. So some people could see it and some people couldn't. Now, I want to use that picture today because what we find in the Gospels is that as we look at the patterns of the life of Jesus, all the teachings and all the incidents or whatever, it's like looking at an autostereogram, because on one surface you can see what's going on, the healing or whatever, but below the surface or within that there's something more, something richer, something more real, if you like, more helpful, more of a blessing. I'll give you an example. Take the story of the 10 lepers. You remember the 10 lepers? They heard Jesus was in town, so they come up to Jesus and they say to him, "Please heal us. Heal us of our leprosy. We've heard you can heal us." And Jesus says to them, "Okay, go and show yourselves to the priest." And the lepers said, "Okay." So they go on their way to the priests, and suddenly, even as they were making their way there, they were healed. Leprosy completely gone. One turned round and came back to Jesus. The other 9 just went on their way. We're healed, wonderful, great, go on their way. But one came back, and the one fell at the feet of Jesus and he worshipped him. In other words, he recognized that this wasn't an ordinary rabbi that dispensed healing. There was something more to Jesus. In other words, where the other 9 saw the pattern only, that one saw the 3D image. He saw beyond the healing and beyond the words of Jesus into who Jesus really was, the divine Son of God. And he threw himself on his face, flat on his face, and he worshipped him. And Jesus said, "Your faith has made you well." Your faith. He gave him that understanding of what had happened. But what's this got to do with the passage today? Well, let me give you a little bit of background first of all. When we start the reading like this, it's sometimes it just refers back to something. It says, when Jesus heard about what had happened, what's he talking about? He's talking about the fact that his cousin John, who had been arrested and put in prison, had been beheaded by Herod and his head served on a platter. And so he decided he wanted to go to a solitary place because he was grieving. He wanted to be with God, he wanted to pray, and he wanted to try and process what would happen. But as he arrives in this solitary place, well, there's a crowd, a large crowd there to greet him. And many of them are sick. But instead of sending them away, Jesus does what he always does. And he says, okay, bring the sick to me. And he heals them. And he spends the whole day healing the sick. There are probably queues, there waiting to be seen by him. But as the day wears on, well, everybody's getting hungry. Nobody's had anything to eat. So the disciples, quite rightly, want to look after the master and say to him, well, look, send him away. There's some villages somewhere, very vague, somewhere nearby somewhere. Send them away and they can go buy something to eat. And Jesus says, no. You give them something to eat. If you think about it, what the disciples were actually doing is handing on the problem to somebody else, because this was a large crowd, 5,000 at least. And to send them to the villages that late in the day, they wouldn't get anything to eat, because all the shops are closed, all the food's been eaten. They didn't have fridges to keep things over to the following day, so a lot of the food had gone. So 5,000 people in the local villages wouldn't get anything anyway. Not much. And so Jesus says, no, you feed them. And the disciples, in fairness to them, instead of falling about laughing, they said, well, come on, 5 loaves and 2 fish. The loaves were probably little buns. We're not talking about big loaves, little buns. And the fish were probably 2 kind of sardine-sized dried fish. Enough maybe for 1 person, 2 at the most. And so they say, in fairness to them, they say, well, we've got this. And they pass them to Jesus. And what does Jesus do? He takes hold of the bread. And listen to this. He says he takes them. He blesses them. He breaks them. And he gives them. Okay, I want you to remember those 4 words. Okay, he takes, he blesses, he breaks, and he gives. Those words are very significant. And as he does that, amazingly, 5,000 people are fed. And he says 5,000 men, Matthew. In other words, they're women and children, so there could well be up to 10,000 people. That's a large crowd. And so 5 loaves, 2 fish goes all the way and feeds them all until they were satisfied, till they were full. And there were 12 basketfuls left over, 1 for every disciple. 12 basketfuls left over. Now, you would have thought that would have made quite an impact on the crowd. You can imagine the crowd were thinking, wait, how the heck do they do all this? Look at that, it's amazing. Where did the food come from? No, all they were concerned about was we had something to eat. All they could see. It made no impact. Now, how do we know it doesn't make any impact? Because they didn't tell us everything, does it? So how do we know that it just went over their heads, so to speak, or just through their stomachs? Well, the thing is about the Bible is there are other accounts of this. And I think you need to just give you a little sort of something about this. There are 4 Gospels. And when the 4 Gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, sat down to write their accounts of Jesus' life, they had tons and tons of material to choose from. They had so much, says John at the end of his Gospel, that you could not fill all the books in the world with what Jesus had done and said. And so they had to be very, very selective. Very selective. John chose 7 signs only out of all the things Jesus did. And Matthew, Mark and Luke also were very careful about what they chose under the Holy Spirit's guidance, it has to be said, inspired guidance, what they would include. But what we find about the feeding of the 5,000, it's the only miracle apart from the resurrection that is reported in each of the 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, the only miracle. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that in this miracle, I'd check it up in, I think it's Mark 10, Luke 6, John 6, and Matthew 14. If you want to understand it a bit more, read all 4 accounts. Because what John tells us about this is of interest here. How do we know that people just didn't get it? Because we are told in Luke 6 this. When Jesus had, John 6, when Jesus had gone over the other side of the lake, the people had walked all the way round and they found him and they said to him, "What are you doing here?" And Jesus could very well have said the same thing. And Jesus says to them, look, I'm telling you the truth. In other words, listen to me very carefully. In the Old King James Version, it's verily, verily. In other words, I tell you the truth, I tell you the truth. It's another way of emphasizing. I'm telling you the truth. You're looking for me because you ate the bread and you had all that you wanted. Not because you understood my miracles. Don't work for food that spoils. Instead, he says, work for the food that lasts for eternal life. This is the food which the Son of Man, that's referring to himself, will give you because God the Father has put his mark of approval on him. So Jesus is really disappointed that this miracle had absolutely no effect on 10,000 people. Had no effect at all. All they'd seen was the pattern. They didn't see what was within the pattern. That was who Jesus was. All they saw is that they were hungry and they got fed. A bit of a miracle. Well, great. But that's about all. They hadn't seen anything further. When I first looked at these pictures and suddenly saw, wow, in all this blurb here, there's a fish. And I showed it to my friend and he said, well, I can't see anything. So I said to him, look, there's a fish. I told him, look at it, it's a fish. Thinking I could help him, give him a bit of a leg up. Nah, couldn't see a thing. And Jesus is saying this, is doing the same thing here. He's trying to give them a bit of a leg up. He's trying to say, well, look, this is what it's about. I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. Don't remember that. That's feed your stomach. But I am the bread of life. I give you life. Your ancestors ate manna in the desert. And he's referring then to the time when the Israelites had left Egypt and in the desert they were complaining they were hungry. So Moses goes to God and says to God, they're hungry. And God says, okay. And he sends a manna from heaven. It's like a bread-like substance. In fact, when they first saw it, they said, what is it? Which is what the word manna actually means. What is it? They didn't know. But they ate it. And it was like a kind of bread and it fed them. And so Jesus continues and says, but the bread that comes down from heaven is such a kind that whoever eats it will not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If you eat this bread, you will live forever. The bread that I will give you is my flesh. We could do a whole sermon about that. Which I give so that the world may live. You see, the point that Jesus is making, that eternal life that he brings, is more important than the life that we actually have here. I mean, it's important to sustain the life that we have here, but this life here doesn't last that long. 70, 80, 90 years, or maybe 100 in some cases nowadays. We need heavenly bread and not just earthly bread. We need Jesus, the bread of life. That's what he's trying to put across to them. I love the stories of Jesus healing the lepers and the paralyzed man that was let down from the roof, and he got his legs again and he went off singing. And I love this, giving sight to the blind. I love all those stories. I love it when we see the raising of Lazarus from the dead, or Jesus going and raising Jairus' daughter to life. Wonderful stories, but every single one of them will die and have died. And the question you ask is then, what next? That's the question. We all have to pass through that same door marked death. What will happen then? That's the question that Jesus raises and has come to answer. I know people who are the complete opposite of me, really. They're obsessed with keeping fit. I'm a bit kind of laid back about it, as you can see. And they go to the gym every single day. Up at 7 o'clock in the morning, religiously, they go to the gym, they work out for an hour, and then they have their kind of low-fat breakfast, their smoothie or whatever, and they're off to work. And they really look after themselves, the body fat index and all that kind of stuff, low salt, low everything, low taste, and all that kind of stuff. And their body's in superb shape. I remember one person said to me, look at me, I got the body of a 30-year-old. I said, well, give it back. But you're 30, they look really good at it. But the question that goes through my mind is, yeah, that's great. But what are you going to look like when you're 80 and 90? And what happens afterwards? You spend all this time looking after your body. What about the state of your soul? Outside, you may look fit and healthy, but what is it like inside? What state is your soul? You see, all through the Gospels, Jesus is presenting himself to people through his miracles and teachings, and his signs and his wonders, and so on. But he doesn't do that just to titillate or to entertain. He does it in order to communicate who he really is, to raise the question, who do you think I am? Well, that's what he said to the disciples. Who do you say I am? Who do you think I am? Why am I here? What is my mission? What can I give you? You know, you start asking those questions and you get the most wonderful answer. But people never go even to the questions. They get their bread and they're happy. They get their healing and they go away. And the big question Jesus wants to ask them goes unquestioned. So, really, the question I want to say this morning is, when you look at Jesus, what do you see? What do you hear? What do you think of what he's done? Do you think he's a good man, a fine teacher, a wonder worker, or, which is the patterns, or do you see the 3D image, which is, he is the Son of God, the bread of heaven? Let me change the metaphor just slightly. I came across this wonderful quote this morning. I always cram last minute before I come to church. I came to this wonderful quote, and it says, "The gospel is all noise until God tunes the ear." The gospel is all noise until God tunes the ear. It's all patterns and all wonderful stories until God gives us the ability to see it. Blessed is the pure in heart, for they shall see God. If we're able to see who God is, then it's all lovely stories. And, you know, we can read about Jesus, and we can read about Buddha, and we can read about Confucius, and they're all the same. But they're not. Jesus is the bread of life. Let me just leave you with one last thing. We're going to receive communion in a minute. And I want you to think about what is happening. Because we come along and is it just bread and wine? Or is there something deeper to it? Just think about what I'm going to do at the table. What Jesus did in the Last Supper. They all sat down for supper. And when the bread was he took the bread and he blessed the bread and he broke the bread and he gave it the bread. And he said to the disciples, "This is my body given for you. The bread of life." Think about it. Does that remind you of anything? Or do you just see the patterns? I'll leave that with you. Let's just pray for a moment.